It's been 80 years since the Soviet Union marched into Berlin, defeating Nazism in Europe. We take a look back at the massive sacrifice the Soviet people made to save the continent from fascism. Hello, I'm Einar Tangen, and this is The Heat. May 9th marks the 80th anniversary of the Soviet Union's victory in the Great Patriotic War, a critical front of World War II. The Soviet Union lost an estimated 27 million people during the war, and the country's efforts were pivotal to the victory over fascism. We begin with this report from Moscow.
President Xi Jinping arrived at the Kremlin, where he was warmly greeted by Russian President Vladimir Putin. The two leaders walked together to Red Square and took their seats on the main viewing stand. As the Kremlin bell rang, the ceremony began. A military band played the Sacred War, while the honor guard escorted the Russian national flag and the victory banner of the Great Patriotic War into the square. In his speech, President Putin said the Soviet Union had defended peace and freedom for all humanity at the cost of tens of millions of lives. He said the victory would always be remembered and that future generations must stay united to uphold its legacy. Putin praised the Chinese people for their heroic resistance during World War II and their contribution to building a shared future. He emphasized that history must never be distorted, victory must never be insulted, and justice will always be on the side of truth. The Russian national anthem was played, followed by a gun salute. Then troops marched in formation through Red Square. In the historical portion of the parade, soldiers wore Soviet-era uniforms, carried flags and weapons from World War II, and recreated the wartime spirit. The modern segment featured Russian military units with fighter jets soaring overhead as Victory Day echoed through the square. Military formations from over 10 countries, including China, were invited to take part in the parade. The PLA Honor Guard marched through Red Square in precise formation, showcasing sharp discipline, high morale, and firm, confident steps. After the ceremony, President Xi joined other leaders in laying flowers at the tomb of the unknown soldier in Alexander Garden, followed by a moment of silence and a group photo. Later, President Xi attended a commemorative banquet hosted by President Putin to mark the 80th anniversary of the Soviet victory in the Great Patriotic War.
To talk more about the Russian victory in the Great Patriotic War, we welcome Sergei Markov. He is a former spokesman for Russian President Vladimir Putin. Sergei, thanks so much for joining us. Great to have you at this important time. Sergei, for many Russians, this victory in the Great Patriotic War is a source of immense national pride. I mean, there's no other country that has sacrificed as much as the Soviet Union did in defeating fascism in Europe. But beyond the military success, how should today's Russia see that moment, that victory? I mean, it was primarily a military campaign. It was also in many ways a political struggle, but it was also a moral fight against fascism, wasn't it?
Yes. Today, really very important day because many reasons. One of the reasons that this war touched every family. For example, my name is Sergei was given to me by my mother in name of her brother who took part in this Great Patriotic War and who gave his life to the victory and did come back at home. And every family has such kind of history, and it's one. Another very important issue that we want to say that Russia is a good country, because now we see tremendous propagandistic campaign of demonizing of Russian people generally and Russian leaders such as Vladimir Putin. Western country and United States and Europe want to show Russians as barbaries who made nothing good in history. by celebrating our victory in Great Patriotic War over the fascists, we say we're good in history. Another important, very important point is that those Great Patriotic War, not just war between nations, it was defending of Russian people from genocide, because 27 million Russians and in other nations which have been part of Soviet Union have been killed. Among them, only 1/3 was soldiers. Most of dead people was just civilians who have been killed in the policy of genocide against Russian people, which have been conducted by fascists. Now we see that Western countries now starting again policy of genocide against Russia, and they're doing this not such a barbaric message as Adolf Hitler and Nazis were doing this. Maybe more accurately, but nevertheless, it's genocide. They try to crash Russian language in Ukraine. They try to prohibit Russian language, Russian culture. They overthrow monumentums of Russian poets and writers such as Tolstoy, Dostoevsky, and others. It's intensive barbarism which orchestrated by Western countries. And talking about our victory, again, all the another organizers of genocide of Russian, we want to say, look, Western countries, look, Europeans and Americans, stop your dreams about organizing new genocide against us.
And Sergei, you know, looking at what you were saying about the challenges that Russians face right now, I mean, how does the legacy of that campaign against the Germans, against the Axis, shape Russia's or Russians' worldview right now?
Because now Russia have new challenges, Russian society rethinking this war and how we can treat it. For example, many years in the case, in Russia we're talking about German fascism, but now people more tend to say about European fascism, because we should take into account that among all these nations who attack Russia now, most of them serve to Adolf Hitler. And look, for example, on the French people, just minority of them fight against Adolf Hitler, but big part of them come with Adolf Hitler to the Russian land to take part in aggression against Russia. Same with Italians, Spanish, Hungarians, New Zealand people, and Dutch people, and more European nations. So it's some change of Russian attitude towards this. And another important point is that Russia should rely more on the own talent, creative people who can change situation. Because every country not prepared for the big war. And it's probably normal to be not prepared. It's exactly Russia have not been prepared for such big landscape of the Ukrainian war.
Right.
But nations must give opportunity to own creative people to create new conditions for such a new style of war. Now we have absolutely new style of war, it's drones war, and how to be prepared more quickly. We should we should learn from the lessons of the Great Patriotic War.
Yeah. Sergei, Chinese President Xi Jinping is in Moscow for these 80th anniversary commemorations of the Soviet victory. What message do you think his visit sends, and how can this shared history between China and Russia help build a stronger front in the challenges that both countries face right now?
Today, I am giving a numerous interview to the different international media, and use, by the way, this color of the victorious Red Army, red and green colors. And I know that international media are shocked by a very friendly and long meeting between leaders of Russia and China, Putin and Xi. Now, different nations and media and experts make the conclusion that one of the political results of this celebration of the Victory Day is the political alliance between Russia and China. And this political alliance, not against somebody, but it's alliance for their own sovereignty. It's clear that the leaders of Russia and China told that they're not against United States, but they against United States policy on pressure against both nations, China and Russia. And another conclusion which is made by international community that Western policy of political isolation of the Russia in fact collapse and doesn't work anymore. If almost 30 leaders of the different nations visit this victory parade, if 13 countries send own soldiers to take part in this parade, it means that political isolation of the Russia does its collapse and doesn't exist.
Sergei Markov, thanks so much for joining us.
My pleasure.
It's time to bring in our panel. From Moscow, Andrey Kortunov is former Director General of the Russian International Affairs Council. From Beijing, Einar Tangen is a Senior Fellow at the Taihe Institute and Chairman of Asian Narratives. And here in our studio, Peter Kuznick is a Professor of History at American University. Welcome to all of you. Andrey Kortunov, let me start with you in Moscow. Thanks for being with us. Can you give us a sense of how significant a moment this is for Russians as the country marks 80 years since the victory over fascism?
Well, I think that the V-Day in Russia has a very special meaning because it's not just another public holiday. If you wish, it's an issue of national identity. Most of other events, like let's say the anniversary of the Communist Revolution of 1917 or the fall of communism in 1991, are very controversial and even divisive. But this holiday unites all the Russians, and not only Russians, but it unites most of the post-Soviet states, And from this viewpoint, this is really exceptional, and this is a very important event for Russians, even today, 80 years after the end of the Great War.
And Andrey, is it especially significant at this time when Russia is facing sanctions from Western countries, when Western countries are trying to isolate Russia?
Well, I think it's a matter of national pride, and also Russians at this particular juncture would like to put the record straight. Of course, there are many falsifications of history in the West, and the Second World War is often regarded in the West as a fight primarily between liberal democracies and illiberal autocracies or totalitarian states, which of course is not exactly what happened back in 1940s. So I think it is important to make sure that the history is not falsified and that the contribution of the Soviet Union to the victory is properly recognized.
Einar Tangen, President Xi Jinping of China, he is in Moscow to mark these commemorations. He's there along with dozens of other world leaders as well. How important was China's role in World War II?
Well, it was equally important. Without China resisting the Japanese, they would have had more troops to pour into their colonial invasion of all of Asia. China's resistance, along with Russia, was the turning point for the war. Remember, these are two countries, communist countries, that lost 30 million people each and that's at the lower end. And they were the ones who made the sacrifices. And unfortunately, as has been referenced by my colleague, the history books in the West make it seem like the United States was the only victor in this, but it was the hard-fought resistance to both Germany and Japan that turned the tide of war.
Peter Kuznick, great to have you with us in the studio. You've actually just returned from Russia, haven't you? You were there for a few days. Getting back to what Einar Tangen was telling us a moment ago, in the West, Russia's role in World War II is often minimized. I mean, if we look at a tweet or a post from President Trump on his social media platform, he said, and I'm quoting him here, "We did more than any other country by far in producing a victorious result, and nobody was close to us in terms of strength, bravery, or military brilliance." Now, I don't want to take away from the United States' role in the defeat of the Nazis. The United States played a big role. But when you listen to what Trump is saying there, that's somewhat of a distortion, isn't it?
It is an extreme distortion. As Medvedev said, it's pretentious nonsense. And as an historian, I can attest to that. Even Churchill said that the Red Army tore the guts out of the German war machine. But if we look now at the polling, I followed the polling over the years, and right after World War II, 57% of the French said that the Soviet Union played the dominant role in defeating Nazi Germany. In recent polling, 7% of the French said that. Across Europe, somewhere between 13 and 17% credit the Soviet Union. You have to remember that throughout most of the war, the US and Britain faced between us 10 German divisions, while the Soviets were facing more than 200 German divisions on their own. It was the Soviets who turned the tide of the war at Stalingrad, at Kursk, at Leningrad, and the Germans were retreating. As Hitler said, the gods of the war have turned against us after the Battle of Stalingrad.
It was also on the Eastern Front that the Germans lost most of their soldiers.
Yeah, maybe 80%. Some estimates have it as high as 6 million on the Eastern Front.
Einar, talking about putting the historical perspective in line, President Xi Jinping, he touched on that. He said China and Russia should take a clear stand to jointly promote the correct historical perspective on World War II. President Xi also criticized what he called counter-current unilateralism. I mean, what are your thoughts on what the president had to say?
Well, obviously, he's drawn a parallel between the fascism that was existing in Nazi Germany and also in Japan with the current efforts to impose a unilateral spoke and hub system that Donald Trump thinks miscalculatingly thinks he could impose. And the idea was to use the might of the U.S. Politically, economically, and militarily to impose unequal treaties on all countries. This was the goal, and it has not been achieved. And quite frankly, the reason it is being resisted is because Russia and China have stood up to the U.S., and this is very important. So this equating this desire to dominate and the necessity to resist is really the lesson that he was talking about.
Andrey, are these commemorations in Russia, are they marred or dampened in any way by the fact that Russia is currently involved in a conflict in Ukraine right now against many Western forces as well? It's the West that's supplying weapons and advice and intelligence to Ukraine.
Well, of course, it is a kind of flavor of the season to somehow equate the Second World War and what is going on right now between Russia and the West. And it is popular in Russia to say that today we see a kind of repetition of what happened 80 years ago. Of course, every historical analogy is questionable, and the situation today is very different from what it was in the beginning of the 20th century. But there is a perception that Russia is once again under siege, and now we have to resist the Western pressure. And we have a very powerful coalition of Western nations against Moscow. And that gives the holiday yet another meaning in this country.
Peter, I want to get a little bit deeper into what you were talking about on how the two fronts fought this battle. Looking at some figures, I mean, the Soviets faced 3.8 million Germans, 7,000 armored vehicles, and on the Western Front it was 600,000 Germans with 2,000 armored vehicles. And you know, the battle on the Western Front has been immortalized in many movies. It's been romanticized in some ways as well. If we look at Saving Private Ryan, and there's another movie called The Longest Day. But give us an idea of what the Soviets faced on their side.
The Soviets faced so much more firepower, so many more men, so much more materiel than on the Western Front. You have to even think of the numbers. So the United States lost 300,000 in combat, 400,000 overall in the war. The Soviets lost 27 million. When I try to help my students understand what 27 million means, that's the equivalent numerically of one 9/11 a day, every day for 24 years. One Pearl Harbor a day, every day for 30 years. This is what John Kennedy said in his great American University commencement address. What the Soviets suffered was the equivalent of the entire United States east of Chicago being destroyed. I mean, we can't even get our minds around that. Perhaps 20% of the population in the Soviet Union. So of course the Soviets celebrate this and commemorate it and make a big deal about it. You can make the case that it was a turning point in 20th century history, and they should be proud of that victory. But when for example, I asked my students, all A students in high school, how many Americans died in World War II? The median answer I got was 90,000. So they were only 300,000 off. I asked them how many Soviets died in World War II. The median answer I got was 100,000. They were only 27 million off. They have no idea what World War II is about, no idea what the Cold War is about, no idea what Ukraine's about today. And it's that lack of historical understanding that in many ways really dooms the United States.
Andrey, something else that is not often talked about, and that is the role that the Soviet army played in liberating those death camps, the German death camps, the Nazi death camps where so many people were killed. What can you tell us about that role?
Well, of course, the Soviet Union was not the only country which liberated death camps of the Nazi Germany, but the majority of these death camps were located in Eastern Europe. So almost by definition, the Soviet army was the only power that could have liberated them. But again, this is something that many people in the West right now find very difficult to accept, because the perception is that it was not really a liberation, but it was just a replacement of one totalitarian system by another totalitarian system. Of course, it was not perceived this way back in 1945. Many people who got their freedom by the Soviet army felt that they were liberated, and definitely they didn't feel that they were subject to another oppression. So unfortunately, this is yet another issue where various historical myths and prejudices now play the dominant role in the narratives. And again, this is something where the record should be put straight.
Einar Tangen, to what extent is President Xi's presence in Moscow at this huge event? He's there with, as I said, several other world leaders. I mean, to what extent is his presence there indicative and a message to the West that the post-World War II order, which has been in place for so many decades, is now changing?
Well, I mean, clearly that is the message, as well as the other heads of state who have chosen to go there against a tremendous amount of pressure coming in from Washington. But I think the larger issue here is that Donald Trump said on the campaign trail that he was dedicated to putting a wedge between Russia and China, because he did not want the nation with the most amount of resources in the world and a border with China, which is the greatest manufacturer in the world, coming together, because they saw it as an existential threat to U.S. hegemony and dominance of the world. So quite clearly, as everyone can see, both in terms of the photographs and also the words, there is no wedge between China and Russia. And this is something that Washington is going to have to ponder for quite some time.
Peter, what are your thoughts on that? I mean, to what extent does this relationship between China and Russia reflect a new world order, a new global order?
I think it's a real game changer. Yep. I think this is a new world order. When the U.S. tried to rally support for Ukraine against Russia, the Global South said, we don't want a part of it. You know, the London Economist said, Biden said it's a battle between autocracy and democracy. The London Economist said to most of the world, it's a battle between autocracy and hypocrisy, because they've seen the U.S. interventions and invasions over and over again. And so they're not judging the Russians by quite the same standard that they might have otherwise. And so at this point, there's a lot of representatives from Africa, from Asia, from Latin America, as well as from other parts of Europe. And the fact that the Serbian and Slovakian leaders went there, despite the threats, not only from the United States, but Kaja Kallas, the foreign policy chief for the EU, who effectively told the Serbs that they're not going to get into the EU if they go there, and they went anyway. So there's a new world order being born, and hopefully the United States can be part of it. But right now, the United States is resisting that multipolar world that Russia and China and the BRICS and Lula and others are the embodiment of.
Andrey, the Soviet Union lost 27 million people, as we heard, in the defeat of Nazism. And if we look at Russia today, I was reading that there is almost every single person in Russia who's lost someone in this victory over Nazism. So it's something that's deeply meaningful, this commemoration right now, for all of Russia.
Absolutely. I think that it is very personal. It's about families. It's about our grandfathers. It's about people whom we know, and at least we used to know. I do remember, the veterans of the Second World War in my neighborhood, and of course, there is a lot of empathy here. It is a formative experience for the whole nation. So I think it will be with us for a long time.
Okay, and that is where we have to leave it. Thanks to all of you for being with us. That is it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington.